So it gives me great pleasure to welcome onto this episode of the segment Sean Connelly, Federal Zero Trust Architect at CISA. Sean, it's a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. This is a pleasure on my end. I'm very happy to be on the segment. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And it's super exciting for us because it's not often you get the chance to engage with someone who's had a direct hand in the authorship of zero trust mandates at sort of the government level. But before we get into that, Sean, tell us a bit about your background and the career path that you've taken to get to being a federal zero trust architect.
Sure. So thank you. So I've been around computers for a long time. Back in the early 80s, I had a science project where I used a TRS-80 Model 3, a Radio Shack computer. It was in the science fair back and learned pretty quickly about user experience because at the science fair, I went to a private school, had an 80-plus-year-old nun trying to use the computer. This is someone literally born back in the 1800s. It's a little different trying to explain to her how to turn on the computer when a syntax error meant. But pushing forward, so then I got more into security or networking first. In the 90s, I installed a ton of Cisco routers, Cisco switches, and that's really where I started to get to know the protocols. And when you do routing, you got to understand the protocols almost, at the Wireshark or Ethereal level to age myself a little bit. And then naturally from that, the networking, you got to start worrying about the perimeter and then going into firewalls in the early 2000s. And then 2004 or five, I had the opportunity to work at the State Department. And the State Department, of course, 200 plus embassies and posts around the world, a global network, some of the most advanced persistent threats, coming at the State Department. So really was a great experience for me in learning about the federal government, learning how a global network works. And then maybe 2013 or so, I believe, had the opportunity to move over to MPPD, the old name for CISA, and I've been at CISA for the last 11 years or so. And really, that time at State Department and that time at CISA, my primary focus has been on that perimeter, and specifically at the federal agencies. Depending on how you count them, there's 100 plus federal civilian executive branch agencies, and we've been working with those agencies helping secure their networks, stop those AP type of threats at the perimeter. And then, Zero Trust came along, of course, and new types of discussions. But really, for the last almost 20 years, it's been working with the federal enterprise and helping secure it in different ways than I think we had before.
Awesome. So you spoke about the perimeter, and I think if we kind of look at the evolution of architectures, of network architectures over the last 20 years, I think probably the greatest sort of evolution has been around on that concept of the perimeter. And I know you've been involved in TIC 1, TIC 2, and more recently TIC 3. If you could explain to the audience how the nature of perimeter has changed and why then the security requirements have to evolve with it.
Sure, that's a great question. So a lot of what we started out with TIC 1, TIC 2, in the mid 2000s, the White House Office of Management and Budget, they had asked a question to all the federal CIOs and federal CISOs. Pretty simple question. How many connections do you have to the internet? How many connections does the agency have to either partner networks or to the internet itself? The number that came back was staggering. No one thought it was that many circuits or that many connections. It was over 4,000 circuits split across, and this is just the civilian side, not even talking about DoD. So really, the first discussions were around traffic aggregation. How could we, not necessarily eliminate those 4,000 internet circuits, but be able to concentrate and do what's called traffic aggregation of those circuits in a finite number of data centers, firewall stacks known as TIC access points. And so that was the first thing was, first concentrate the data. And then on top of it, now that we have these circuits concentrating these finite number of TIC access points, let's start to put a standardized baseline security perimeter around those devices. And so again, this goes back to 2008, 2012, up to really about 2015 or so, when there was that common architecture was more focused on the what we call the
Mm,
north-south traffic versus the east-west traffic, and it was really forcing all that data. It was called a tick
mm,
tax. We had a lot of agencies that had offices, branch offices in the Midwest or the West Coast, but the agency's headquarters had their tick access points on the East
mm,
Coast. So now even across the CONUS, across the
mm,
America, you got 40, 50 milliseconds of time, and if the data center was over in the West Coast, some agency had to go across from LA over to DC, have their traffic go out, that north-south traffic, and back
mm,
across to the West Coast, and it was literally a tax. It was a compromise. And so that was when the discussions with cloud started to really evolve and mobile started to erupt on the scene, that we needed to look at a different way. The perimeter model, the legacy castle moat model, was never, I think, idealized. Even back, talking about Cisco and the Jericho Forum, which I've heard John
mm.
Kindervag talk about. Um, Even back then, I was talking, we need to get deperimeterization, as the Jericho Forum called it. I think John talks about how sometimes Jericho is focused on like TLS connections, encrypted connections um, from the client to the server. But Jericho had a number of commandments in
Mhm.
there in their original document, and one of them was something, I'm paraphrasing here, but like the more you can put security close to the data, the
Yep.
better it is. And that makes
Yep.
sense, right? And that was exactly opposite what Tick 1 and Tick 2
Yep.
was. It was forcing the data, forcing the sessions through those firewall stacks. So that's really where like the federal enterprise was, if you will, around 2015 or
Mhm.
16. We started on this new journey.
I actually want to. It's interesting you mentioned that point because one of the reports that you participant in authoring, the report to the president on federal IT modernization, and in the executive summary, one thing that's really interesting that you call out. Um, these actions enable agencies to move from protection of their network perimeters and managing legacy physical deployments toward protection of federal data and cloud optimize deployments. The report also emphasizes a risk-based approach that focuses agency resources on their highest value assets. And I think that's really interesting because this almost directly leads to your focus in Tick 3, which is away from sort of perimeters of the organization at
Mhm.
large, but really moving that control and focusing on the security of the key things that you're trying to protect.
Yes, thank you for that report. I was one of a number of authors on there, and it takes time in federal government to move some of the different bureaucracy or policy or mandates. And to your point, that was written in 2017. A lot of those co-authors were still with us when we were starting to roll out the Tech 3 guidance after the memo was released in 2019. But it took those number of years, even though, to your point, we knew where we wanted to
Mm,
go, but it still takes a while just to shape the policy in a way to begin to not force that change. I don't
mm.
want to say tick forcing anything, but begin to have different opportunities, different possibilities. But just like you said, it's more about cloud optimization, data security, moving away, from I won't say moving away directly from network security, but having a balance
Yeah.
between data security and network security.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think the way that this particular report and just that network modernization consolidation, the way it's phrased, I feel that sets the framework. Sorry, that sets sort of the starting point for that shift
Yeah.
towards adopting a zero trust approach.
No, literally, that was um, John Kindervag, I'll mention him 100 times in this interview probably, but back in whatever it was, 2010 or 2011, was he at Forrester and he wrote that, the Chewy
Mm,
Center document. Back then I was at State Department and I was running around State Department with that guidance saying this is where we need to get to. Not sure how to get there, but this is exactly the framework to move forward. Honestly, at that time, I think we interpreted it more as a NAC solution, a network
hmm
access control type solution. To be fair, NAC is moving security close to the data. You got like enforcement, if you will, on the switch, and you got an agent or client, 802.1x on the client itself going to switch. But even that, I think, was just part of the equation. It took a while for the discussion to evolve. We saw what Google's been doing for the last 5, 10 years from there when they got compromised about a decade ago, and how they've used Beyond Core and how they're doing encrypted data. So I think all these discussions were going on. And then, like you said, just in terms of opportunity of timing, when that report came out in 2017, really zero trust is starting to resonate around the government in different ways. Up at NIST, this is pre-COVID. NIST was holding a number of like workshops on zero trust every year. There's an annual gathering. Uh, NSA, they were having a large participation in those meetings. Randy Resnick was at NSA at the time. Now he's the DoD Zero Trust Portfolio Management Officer. He was there. Some of the key authors of that IT modernization report mentioned were at these conferences. So it was starting to percolate around. It just wasn't really in policy yet, per se, of zero trust. At the same time, like you mentioned in that modernization, there was that TIC memo, or the TIC, modernized TIC. And so we tried to position the TIC 3 efforts to be able to support and align zero trust as much as possible in there.
Got it. Because the other thing that I noticed before we move off to away from the report on the IT modernization is that it's really setting the stall also for public cloud adoption by federal agencies. Why did you see this shift in moving away from being overly perimeter centric and network centric to being more critical asset focused in terms of security? Why did you feel that was essential to the adoption or to accelerate the adoption of cloud by federal agencies?
Well, unfortunately, we've had a number of case studies where it's shown having this broad, perimeter and based a lot of your focus on the perimeter, the adversary is still getting compromised. A lot of the efforts that you mentioned with the IT modernization effort actually came out of the OPM breach in 2015, and there was a response to the OPM breach. We'll probably talk about the cyber EO and the zero trust stuff going on the last couple of years. A lot of that was focused on the SolarWinds breach. So sometimes there's these breaches and it captures the attention of leadership, and that forces these discussions in new ways. But to your point, cloud was going on long before the breaches happened. Of course, FedRAMP, the GSA-led cloud modernization or ATO process, that's been around for about a decade, but took a couple years for the program to really stand up and start getting the different cloud providers to be supported in the FedRAMP program. I can remember when Matt Goodrich was celebrating like the number 20th CSP ATO around 2014 or 2015. Now I think they're well over 300 different packages or ATO. So it takes a while sometimes for this to happen. But yeah, the cloud adoption was happening just like you said at the same point. The larger or faster embracing of the cloud was starting to really happen at the agencies.
Understood. So we'll come back onto cloud in a second, and you mentioned it yourself that some of these, there was the OPM breach in the mid 2010s, and then of course SolarWinds a couple of years ago that I guess was the straw that broke the camel's back, and really and maybe it forced the publication of EO 14028. So can you talk to us a bit about, you were there when these things were being formulated, right? Talk a bit about the process.
Sure. So a couple of things are happening. I'm not going to get into politics of it, but there was also administrative change. Chris DeRusha, the federal CISO that was coming in, Eric Mill, Eric was part of that group that wrote the IT modernization report. I worked with Eric for a long time. There's a number of key individuals coming in to government, and again, off of the SolarWinds compromise and reverberations from that, we, government, knew we had to be able to set new standards. No one's saying, forget about network perimeter. There's too much legacy tech, if you will, inside agencies. No one's saying get rid of the firewalls, but we need a more comprehensive architecture solution. So going back to what you talked about, the cyber executive order, there was a number of taskers in there toward OMB, toward GSA, toward CISA, toward NIST, about starting these conversations for how to move forward on a more comprehensive architecture solution. So again, a lot of those people, it's almost like a baton toss, if you will, from different groups, but there was, going back to the IT modernization report, there was a clear momentum or direction set in that, and then the cyber executive order was able to manifest more particularly, and just like you're saying, focus on zero trust itself in ways that we didn't have that opportunity, I think, under like a prior policy or just legacy code and stuff.
So without like an incident like SolarWinds, or I think Colonial Pipeline was not many months after SolarWinds, were those just served as providing great focus onto the importance of EO 14028, or without those would this order have been potentially delayed and maybe not got the importance and focus that it has had?
Yeah, I'll definitely say there was leadership attention in ways I'm not sure it would have been there without it. I mean, SolarWinds, recognize that really one of the attacks really going on under the covers of SolarWinds was the focus on Microsoft and how the agencies had a lot of their critical data in different Microsoft cloud tenants. And so we had to be able to, again, get a more comprehensive solution in front. One thing I think we missed when we went to TIC 3, it also happened, of course, just right when COVID happened, like the release of the TIC documents. And we were going to release the cloud use case for TIC, the first use case. There was a number of use cases required for agencies when OMB released the TIC memo 1926. I'm forgetting these numbers now, 1926. There's a number of use cases, and we were going to start with the cloud use case because that's where I think where most attention was. But when COVID hit and the focus for remote work, we were forced to change up and release a remote user use case. A lot of the same capabilities between what you're doing to protect remote user toward the branch office and then toward the cloud. There are some similarities, but there are some differences you want to call out. And I think agencies, are we confusing the messaging? And some people looked at what we did was, oh, we're just focusing more on the user. And that really wasn't the intention. So we had to release the cloud use case at the end. But where we're going this is the whole time we were releasing these different use cases for TIC, we're also working with OMB, the White House, Claire Monterona's team at the federal CIO, and Krista Rush's team, the federal CISO, about how to have that more comprehensive solution architecture. And then, so let's see, so with the cyber executive order, and then in the right after that was released a draft to the agencies of the Zero Trust strategy memo from OMB. And again, that was part of the push to really start having the discussions at the leadership level. I understand from OMB, they were having discussions like with the deputy secretaries, which are usually, the second in charge of the agencies themselves underneath the secretary. So it had the leadership attention, which is, listen to John Kindervag, this has to be Zero Trust, both the top-down alignment and bottom-up. And I'm more on the bottom-up side and helping push where I can, but we needed that top-down leadership. And like we were talking before the call, having a president available with this clarity saying, agencies, you need to move forward on this modernized cybersecurity architecture certainly helped get everyone's attention.
Oh, I mean, standing on the outside of that, absolutely. When that came out, and then I think everything that has followed from that, I can't think of there being more excitement in the cybersecurity world of something that is coming out of a government in the way that that's driven it. When it dropped for you, being on the inside, did you feel, wow, this is a seminal moment in sort of cybersecurity history, and I'm in the middle of it?
Well, that's a good question. I never thought or heard that in that way. It's been a number of like baton toss. Um, Looking back now, sure, that may be looking at as like the critical moment where a lot of things got released. But having been at CISA and working with OMB and GSA, there's a lot of effort over almost a decade to get to that point. But clearly, the response, the interest towards zero trust, the where the government was looked at post cybersecurity after OPM and the conversations or expectations toward federal cybersecurity posture towards where we are now and how we're being able to talk to you just in general and saying this is how the federal government's doing, this is what we're looking at. It's just a totally different shift to your point. It's changed the narrative in a way I don't think anyone would have expected. And that's really, compliment again OMB, the White House, their foresight in being able to position the architecture and the memos in a way to gain everyone's attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking very briefly offline before starting this that what is also particularly, I think, eye-opening, interesting about the memo is that coming from the White House and the Office of the President, some of the the detail and the specificity um,
Mhm.
is unexpected, unusually unexpected, but also very welcome because we've seen too many, and we continue to see like too many sort of regulations which are so high level that when you say, okay, what do I actually need to do? It's not
Yeah,
particularly clear.
yeah.
So why was it so important to have that almost level of technical granularity in something that's coming out from the Office of the President to drive adoption?
No, that's a great question, and we got to be careful here because I could hear John Kindervag putting like pins in the Sean Connelly voodoo doll. While we can concentrate on the tech a little bit, it's really more about the cultural
Yes,
change
of
that
course.
happens. But to your point, there was always discussions about protecting the data in new ways. My old boss Sarah Mosley, when she was the chief technical officer at CISA, she was out there preaching, got to protect the data back in 2015, 2016. ACT-IAC, which is another one of those quasi think tanks here in Washington, D.C., they released a paper, I think in 2018 about zero trust. So it was out there. But to your point, until you start putting very tactical things into a zero trust memo, the cyber executive order, that really gained everyone's attention. But even, and we could talk a little bit about this, even when we put in like agencies can move fast identity online, there are questions like, what does that really mean? There were all at the same time, going back to TIC, we knew there needed to be changes in the way that agencies can connect to the cloud and connect to their users, whether they are the remote users, enterprise users, or customer base, and moving that traffic through those physical TIC access points was not the way to move forward with modern infrastructure. So we needed to be able to release some pressure, offer new ways. So starting to see agencies use secure access service edge, right? SASE or security service edge, SSE solutions in ways that just wasn't possible before. So there has been, almost like you said, a very tactical way, pillar by pillar, and just to go back, sorry, a bit with OMB and that strategy. We aligned our release of our zero trust maturity model so it complemented OMB strategy. And so CISA, we had those 5 pillars, right? Identity, device, data, application network, and OMB's memo came out that way. And just like you talked about, had for the identity pillar, agencies need to do this. For the device pillar, agencies need to do that. And it gave a very clear roadmap of how to raise security posture across the federal enterprise. But really, it's the organizational changes that happen at the same time that are critical for this.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that the words you used there were really good about um, it's really about forcing a cultural shift or a strategy shift. But um, just specifying that without at least some level of tactical detail um, means that it's very hard to then pin people down because it's like, okay, well, show me actually what you've done, and the tactical bits help them
Mm-hmm.
show what they've done. So you spoke about the zero trust maturity model, and there was, I think, 2.0 of it was released last year. 1.0 was a couple of years ago. Uh, Talk to us about. I mean, that's fairly sort of quick, hot on the heels of releasing sort of the second version. Why did you feel it was necessary to sort of push through with that second? What are the key learnings from the first version, the implementation of it, feedback that informed the improvements, enhancements in 2.0?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's start out this way. So we released the first version in summer of 2021, the same time OMB released their zero trust strategy draft. And really, even though we released version 1 because I think it was required of us in the cyber executive order, in reality, it was more of a
Mm-hmm.
draft. We wanted to just, get something out there. One of the reasons we wanted to release at the time was agencies were responsible for sending in their zero trust
Mm-hmm.
implementation plan to the White House. And from ourselves at CISA and OMB, we want agencies to have like a common taxonomy, a common language when they're talking to us, because respectfully to OMB and ourselves, it's going to be difficult for reading 100 plus plans and they don't have some commonality. So we released the maturity model to help guide the agencies and shape the agency's discussion when they came to us and told us how they are improving. And we released it. We knew we were going to have to do a second version. So what was interesting, I mentioned those implementation plans that the agencies had to release to OMB. And then the spring and summer 2022, there was a Tiger team with ourselves and OMB and some other agency SMEs, and we went through agency by agency the number of implementation plans. There's 20, 25 CFO Act agencies, all the large agencies, and then a number of the small agencies too. We went through, again, team by team through those and had these discussions with the agencies to understand where they were on their zero trust journey. All that got then reflected into that version 2 of the memo that we released about, I think, April of last year. So really reflected those discussions, again, 100 plus working group meetings with agencies, a lot of meetings with the different vendor community itself, and then academia. At the same time, there's interest from other governments, and so ourselves and other groups are talking to different governments, like how is the federal government moving forward zero trust? How are you supporting connection to the cloud? And so all those type of discussions fed into that maturity model. One thing I mentioned before, one of the first tasks for agency was for being able to move to a fast identity online, FIDO2. And to your point, what you're talking about before, you could put like language into policy, but still, agencies still want to know, is this what you really mean? And for decade plus now, agencies have been living off their PIV or CAT card, where you see federal government employees and they have their card. But we needed other ways to be able to move multi-factor phishing-resistant MFA forward. So in that policy, OMB had the foresight to put in the ability to use FIDO. But in those discussions in 2022, almost every agency we had to go and discuss what we meant by it, because identity is kind of one of those funny industries in terms of agencies, how they respect. Some agencies have like an identity council, other agencies have an identity SME, or if you just even ask the agency, who leads the identity strategy for your agency? Is it the Active Directory group? Is it the PKI group? Is it like the cloud, the people that run the cloud accounts? And so each of those, we really had almost to get in front of and explain to them what we meant by being able to use fast identity online. It was just reflective of some of the questions that are coming at us at each of the different pillars out of the strategy.
Awesome. So, what would like the key, if you were to sort of boil down some of those key bits of feedback that you received when you're looking across all of these plans, what were can you just bubble up a couple of the most significant bits of feedback that informed the updates to the maturity model?
You mean version 2,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The different version? Yeah, just give a perspective. It's a 20-page document, and not even including all the working groups we just talked about. Just when we had the public RFC in the September, I think, of 2021, we had over 200 pages of comments, 300 plus comments, 200 plus pages and 300 plus comments on a 20-page document. So it took a while to distill the common themes that you're talking about. And of course, some vendors want to position their tech. We had to take the tech spiel out of it and make sure we're really talking about what we're trying to do, what's our intent here. We put prioritization on what the agencies wanted. So for example, agencies wanted, this kind of was interesting, was more information about deprovisioning, about how to deprovision devices. There's a lot of support, okay, let's bring something online. There's not much about deprovisioning. So we wanted to enforce that, to start having the agencies think how they have to deprovision stuff. I mentioned the MFA, the phishing resistant MFA and FIDO2 alignment. We put stronger language both toward that and V2. Another thing was on the network side was more toward microsegmentation. And it was interesting. So we, again, talking to the community, it was really about application segmentation. So there's application segmentation go on the app pillar, but we're doing it through different networking tools, and we decided to put it in the networking. And to be fair, all models are wrong. Some models are useful, and we're just trying to release this. We're not saying this is the only way to look at it. This is when we talk to agencies, when we talk to community, just help the agency understand, or the community understand, what does CISA mean. We're not saying we're certainly right in what we're talking about toward application security, segmentation, should it be the network pillar. Another one is encryption. Some communities thought that the encryption should be, I think, in the data pillar. I think we have it either in the network or application pillar. So it's just a lot of different ways to position it. I'm definitely not here to say which is right or wrong. Another maturity model that's out there is, I mentioned Randy Resnick before in Department of Defense and their zero trust. DoD's got a lot of great information out there. They got strategy, they got the reference architecture, They lean into a lot of the capabilities of controls, and they have a maturity model, or I'm sorry, like the pillars. I think they have 7 pillars going across. We have we have the 5 pillars I mentioned before, and then 3 cross-cutting capabilities: visibility, automation, and governance. And we just really honestly, a lot of this is just
Yeah.
aesthetics. When you listen to Randy's talk, when you listen to us, we're saying the same thing, just slightly different, give it a little different optics and help people understand. Because one of the things I do, I come from a marketing background, and one of the things you hear about is you got to explain something 7 times, 7 different ways, and that's what we're trying to do here. Is just help explain this in different ways. The intent, I'll go back to what John Kindervag was positioning 10 plus years
Yeah,
ago.
absolutely. And um, my mind's also racing with all the things that I can react to and everything you've just said. But let's start with the last thing first. I think the being able to frame it in any n number of ways. Ultimately, I think as zero trust practitioners, really what we want is for the agencies, for organizations, etc., to adopt a zero trust strategy and then execute on the tactics to mature their
Mm-hmm.
posture. And so as long as whatever way we tell that story, as long as one of those ways resonates, that's great. So having multiple ways
Yeah.
to tell it
Yeah.
is super is really important. I Oh God, the question has got out of my got out of my head. I'm sure it'll come back to me in a second. Um, it's rare for me to be lost for words.
Speechless. Is it something on DoD or something on a
it's,
maturity model or something I want
it must be just being blinded by the quality of your answer, Sean, that I'm just
to?
left
Oh,
speechless.
geez, nice
Um,
try.
let's talk about sort of that path towards maturity, right? And in the ZTMM, if you'll let me call it that, you've got sort of those traditional, initial, advanced, and optimal stages, and you have these mapped out for each of the pillars. Um, when you initially released the maturity model and then, of course, the follow up in 2.0, did you initially see that organizations sort of heading headlong into getting up to sort of optimal maturity in one pillar before they then move to the next
Yeah.
pillar?
All right.
Because I see that reflected in some of your 2.0 wording.
Yeah, that's a great point, and something I didn't even mention about the difference between V1 and V2. The V1 has this traditional, advanced, and optimal, and in V2 we have traditional, initial, advanced, and optimal. And we really need to put that initial in because there's such wide distance, if you will, between traditional and advanced, and like we needed some way for initial to be able to just have an agency or organization understand when are they starting out on that on their journey. And so it was critical for us to have initial in there itself. But to your point, a lot of language, when you talk to a lot of organizations, a little different in the civilian executive branch agencies where they're already starting their journeys, but we're talking to a lot of agencies that are still in the traditional and just
Mm-hmm.
starting out. And so it's just migrating just from traditional to initial is where a lot of the greater set of organizations are. But to your point, like the pillars themselves, again, we're not we intentionally made it abstract in a way so it could be broadly interpreted. But we have heard some like believing we need to get to the optimal identity pillar before we can focus on the network pillar, and that was really not the intent of our model in terms of categorization or how we align them. Ideally, organizations are going to be moving parallel in the different columns themselves. And, a lot of what my focus on and John Kindervag's focus on, I think some of the stuff you see from Zero Trust really started out more on the network side. So I think some agencies are already, or organizations were a little more advanced, if you will, on the network versus the data pillar. In general, going back to we started this conversation, a lot of this is about data security in new ways, but I think the data security pillar has been the weakest
Mm.
and like we had the most to do. And we've almost, and this, again, I realized this when we started writing the maturity model, it's almost like we put these other categories, application and device and network and identity around data because we just couldn't really get the handle
Yeah.
on data at scale in ways we can now.
Yeah, I completely agree. But I think also in terms of that. the way you move on the maturity model, and I think the mountain climbing um, graphic that you've got in the doc is appropriate because it really is sort of. And if I think back also to your the IT modernization report, it's that risk based approach. And if I think about that
Yeah.
path up the mountain, it's what is my what is the low hanging fruit or the next easiest step I can take to get me to the next stage, and I kind of zigzag up the way, and it could be between,
Yeah.
and that zigzag could take me from one pillar to the other because the next obvious thing based on my risk assessment is in a different pillar to where I'm focused today.
Yeah, just a personal note. So we released the maturity model, I think, in April of last year. And within a week, just by coincidence, Kevin Mandia, everyone knows Kevin Mandia, was presenting at RSA conference, and he had took that maturity model mountain and put it into his deck. And I'm sure, to get the talking points and get them approved by everyone is pretty monumental. But for them to be able to put that mountain in the deck was pretty complimentary to us. But full disclosure, it was John Sims, my colleague. He was more the one pushing for that mountain. It has resonated. I think the tease, though, is when you get to the summit of that mountain, it's really a mountain range.
Yeah,
There may be
yeah,
mountains beyond you. Not to kill the analogy, but the reason I say that is because that optimal, we'll move the flag, but we'll move the goalpost at some point, right? As tech evolves, we need the optimally new ways. But yeah, so for some reason, to your point, that has resonated going up the mountain with the way I didn't see coming.
yeah. I really like it. So so if we think about um, progress that the agencies are making, how are they tracking this? How frequently is it being tracked, and how are they being held accountable?
Yeah, I will tiptoe around that. I've been the luxury of being an architect over at CISA. We're focused on cybersecurity, but to be absolutely fair, it is a priority question for Office of Management Budget, the Hill, and we have teams at CISA that are helping answer those questions themselves. There is a critical need to have measurement. So going back to the strategy, the federal zero trust strategy, agencies are being measured against how much of their fleet, if you will, their ecosystem has phishing resistant MFA on it. How much of their data in the cloud has data categorization? So there are measurements, thankfully, going back to what we talked about before, to the memo itself to measure that. And each of those is, to me, it's the trending that I could see. I don't want to get deep dive into which agency versus which
Of
agency
course.
is doing what, but it's more, we are clearly seeing a push towards phishing resistant MFA in the
Hmm.
last few years. That can only help, the federal government can help the citizens in terms of their being able to use these networks securely. We're seeing a clear trend toward agencies moving off of what we talked about with Tick 1, Tick 2. A number of federal agencies had to use commercial tick providers. They're called MTIPS providers. They're a managed service that a few different vendors provide, and agencies for years have been asking for other solutions besides MTIPS. It's very costly. It's very inefficient, like I talked about the Tic Tacs. We're starting to see agencies move off of MTIP solutions, be able to move on SASE
Hmm.
solutions, security service edge solutions in ways that clearly not only does it create more efficient networks, things a better security overall, better get better visibility. So there are clear trends toward each of those pillars that complement, go back to claiming success, if you will, on some of those different taskers out of the strategy.
Awesome. And I remember when the memo was published and the expectations were set that there was sort of a need to see a significant progress by fiscal year 24. Um, from your perspective, uh, are the agencies on the way to sort of achieving that? It seems so.
Yeah, so the OMB is working with the agencies to measure some of that, but again, it goes back to um, the MF phishing resistant MFA adoption is critical. Being able to deploy, they didn't really mention endpoint detection and response (EDR). There's a large push of being having a greater number of devices supporting some type of endpoint detection response agent in there. The network side, I mentioned SASE, so we are I don't want to say measuring, we are working to ensure that we, CISA, still gain visibility because it's critical for our mission as agencies are moving onto these new platforms. So there's a number of ways that OMB and the Hill and different organizations, I think even GAO to be responsible, to mention them, they're measuring in new ways.
So what happened? So we're in fiscal year 24. That comes and goes. We've made the progress that was desired. What now happens to sort of provide the impetus for the next stage of progress, or is the momentum
Yeah,
sufficient that now sort of the agencies will sort of they're on their merry way and they'll continue?
no, that's a great question. From my perspective, I'm able to say OMB is a team captain on Zero Trust, and some of this we'll have to wait to see what comes out of OMB.
Mm-hmm.
But there are discussions about what's the next step. To your point.
Okay, I just remember that thing that I'd forgotten, and it was you were talking about the comments that were sort of provided back on the Zero Trust Maturity Model 1.0, and I remember sort of providing comments on behalf of our
Oh, great.
company. But I do remember, I think the point you made about certain vendors that essentially just chucked in their entire product documentation and said, "Okay, this is how you deploy our product to do X." And I remember seeing sort of versions of that in some of the revisions that we got to review and provide comments on. And I remember going in sort of rewriting it from the perspective of this is kind of the capability you're trying to introduce, and this is why, etc. So if you dig through your comments, I'm sure you've come across things that I've commented on at some point. Um, the so just
I got a different way. I got a different way to spin that though. One of the positions I hold is that I'm an alternate board member on the Tech Modernization Fund,
mhm,
the Technology Modernization Fund's TMF. Just for everyone's awareness, TMF is a solution for agencies that may not be able to get funding through normal channels that both Congress and the White House are able to, I think in 2018, create this other alternative way for agencies to submit proposals to the TMF. It's run out of GSA, close alignment with OMB and ourselves. It's just a number of agencies, but it's a way for agencies to send proposals in how to modernize a
mhm,
system in a new way. But when we have those discussions, I know I look at the TMF website a lot. You can read right on the front page. There's articles about how there's modernization of like systems for an agency for farmers to be able to process their data faster. There's another award that went to an agency for businesses, be able to get uh, custom goods through their proper ports faster. Another one toward veterans and getting their service benefits faster. What you don't hear me saying is you don't hear me saying that those agencies may have been awarded something with MFA, or
mhm,
that the agencies may be using, shifting to the cloud and take advantage of clouds of data tagging and data categorization. But embedded in each of those awards and other ones are the zero trust principles, are the zero trust tenets, and that's what it's all about with TMFs: getting either services, funds, or information to people faster. And so a lot of that is done. Again, ideally, we want the zero trust tenants and the products to be baked in. So, like you're talking about with the vendors and how they came to us with their comments and their services and their intellectual property, we were able to distill out, okay, what is the real intent here? Where's the real
yeah,
value, and use that to inform the maturity model.
awesome. So what do you see as the when you look forward and you look forward sort of and you think about, okay, how do we continue to apply sorry, um when you look forward and the continued maturity of zero trust across agencies, what do you see as sort of the key challenges that you foresee going forward?
Yeah, so let me answer a little differently. Like, what has been the challenger that's really started to unlock in the last little bit? Honestly, this I think is actually more in the cyber executive order, again, the precursor to the memo. But there was a need for each agency to have a zero trust SME,
Mm-hmm.
subject matter expert. Um, we've watched how that role has bounced around inside some agencies where it may have been, just an abstract example, but may have started out where the zero trust SME was like in the CIO office, and then it may go to the CISO office, and then it may go to the CTO. And it's been indicative of like just trying to understand how do you position the zero trust principles and the ideas, and then we call it the discipline inside the agency. And don't get me wrong, there's no perfect answer. Some agencies have done more like zero trust councils, and they brought in some of their SMEs from the different pillars, if you will, like have identity SMEs in there, network SMEs. Other agencies have done more where they have a almost a single person or a single office lead that for that agency. So some of it was just positioning of the organizational changes that are happening within the agency itself, going from a lot of time, like as agencies are moving to the cloud, how those organizational changes. So before, a lot of like the network operations or security operations for data center security or data center operations focused on packets and focused on making sure we got our PCAP and have our IDS or having our sensors in place. Well, all that type of visibility changes in the
Yeah.
cloud. And so having those organizational changes in place so agencies now have the right type of SMEs to balance out. Sometimes, you still see it with the cloud providers. They're having to provide, I don't call it legacy, but some of the primordial services. So PCAP's when we always hear that the vendors are having to go back and support. I think cloud providers in general didn't think SOX and NOx would want to have that raw packet capture. But that's how a lot of the organizations, I'm not just speaking for federal government, I mean, just in general, a lot of organizations still have that desire, have tools, or have playbooks based around packet capture. And so there is still that organizational change that is happening, at different organizations at different rates that are key, I think, to being able to take advantage of zero
Mm.
trust, cloud native, more modernization solutions.
I mean that I think opens up a potentially opens up another can of worms, which is an entire separate podcast episode. Is about sort of how, as you modernize, um, how do you avoid sort of lifting your sort of some of your legacy debt and bringing it with you and adopting new
Sure,
techniques
sure.
and procedures? But that's for when you come back to the podcast, Sean. We'll have an entire episode on
Oh, well,
that. So, but just a couple of things before we wrap. Taking a bit of a global perspective, I'm sure there are governments globally, many sort of allies of the US that look at the success the US and the US agencies are having with the adoption of zero trust and seeking to adopt similar approaches to drive their security modernization. Are you able to sort of put some context, some details about how you're seeing the proliferation of zero trust beyond the borders of the US?
sure. I'll be careful here, but there have been discussions with agencies. Some of the federal other governments, some of the discussions are toward FedRAMP, and just in terms of the program that FedRAMP is, some governments are still trying to stand up, their version of government or their version of FedRAMP inside their country. Some countries have done what we did with TIC2 in terms of they had this data or this network aggregation going on, these finite TIC access points. And now the governments are the same place where there's cloud, there's mobile. And so governments are coming to us, how do we take advantage of that secure access service solution or the SSE solution? So we are having those type of discussions. Another one going back to the phishing resistant MFA. That's another area. Again, I think where the federal government's a little different, where we had those pivot cat cards, but it's been a little different toward other governments. But you are seeing a clear interest now in 502 solutions. So it's a broad spectrum of those discussions, not just positioned toward what CISA does, but again, cloud evolution and just data sovereignty is another area we hear a lot of questions about.
Awesome. Okay, so to wrap, um, because unfortunately we do have to bring this to an end. So you're in a meeting room kickoff with a new agency, and they're about to start their zero trust journey, and they say, "Hey, Sean Connelly, Federal Zero Trust Architect, We have no clue what zero trust is. Can you enlighten us on what we're getting ourselves into? What do you say?
So that'd be interesting because there are no new agencies in the federal government, right? So it's a lot of this is very very old technology. We got some of the oldest tech, right? No one's saying like to NASA that they need to put fission resistant MFA on the Voyager satellites that are 10 billion miles away, or need to put an EDR agent on the Martian rover. So it's not as much about new organization, but to your point, where I think you're going with the question. I mentioned John Kindervag a couple times. I had the pleasure of working with John a few years ago on a different report to the president. It's from the NSTAC. I always get this wrong. I think it's a National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee. That document's available on CISA's website. If you just type in NSTAC Zero Trust, it should come right up to it. But in that document, one of the things that's in there, and this is what's great about collaborating with John, was John puts in the 5 steps for zero trust. And John, to his credit, is always saying zero trust is really easy. So in that document are those 5 steps. And first one is define the protect service.
Yep.
That's the first step. Now that's different than we were with TIC 2. It was like whatever you're trying to protect. You're trying to protect the mainframe, trying to protect someone in the cloud, put it behind the TIC. There was no define the protect service. In zero trust, it is what are you trying to protect? Now that you had that first step, the next step is mapping the transaction flows. One of the key things, though, going back to what we just talked about with transaction flows, we don't just mean like system to system, client server. Yes, those are important, like some type of packet capture or just way, but it's also the organizational, who's talking to who, how's the firewall team talking to the accounting team or to the organization itself. So those type of flows are critical here. Then you start building out this new architecture. And again, it's data-centric solutions. So you're trying ideally to put security closer to what's being protected. Part of the key is going back to the maturity model is as you're building out this new system, you ideally want to start getting like different signals from each of those pillars. The network pillar you want to signal, from the host device you want to signal, from the identity you want to signal. All those signals then can feed it into what the 4th step is, which is creating the policies. I mean, dynamic policies. So, as a client's talking to a server, there can be access of that, but also, again, the organizational policies themselves. And then the 5th step is both manifest and monitor and maintain it. So those 5 steps, which starts with defining the protect surface, map the transaction flows, build up the architecture, define the policies, and then maintain and monitor. Those are the 5 steps and things that would start with that question.
Awesome. Well, Sean, I mean, I have so many more questions for you, but I think we are time is of the essence, right? I know you've got a busy day to get back to, so I thank you so much for this time today. Really appreciate it. It's been fantastic speaking with you.
No, this is great. You clearly know network modernization, know where we're going. This has been a fun conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sean.